Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. C's History Walks. Today we're going to go on a trail of T.E. Lawrence, and I'm actually going to go across England to look at it. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go to the Hijaz Railway and Aqaba and the Crusader castles of the Middle East, but I am going to be starting here in Oxford, where in 1896 the Lawrence family moved here. He was born in South Wales, but he moved here in Oxford in 1896, and he lived here right through his childhood, right through to his university years. So let's see Lawrence's Oxford first. Now, as Lawrence grew up in Oxford, of course, he went to school in Oxford, and in the turn of the 20th century, this building here was the City of Oxford High School for Boys, where he studied, of course, and he was famously a good sportsman, excelled academically along with his brother, etc., etc. Very key part of his time growing up. It is no longer a school, sadly. It is now the Faculty of History at Oxford. So when you're all going to go and study history at Oxford, this is where you will come and study. And of course, if you actually do go there, you'll see just in the lobby there is a little bust of T.E. Lawrence, which you can go and have a look at. But this is where he went to school in Oxford. Behind me is Jesus College, Oxford, which was Lawrence's undergraduate college here. He went to a few others post this, but this I think is perhaps more of the making of him, where he studied history, and he specialised in the end in Crusaders, and specifically Crusader castles, hence why he went on that tour and maybe started his love of that region through Syria, Jordan and the Hijaz area as well. But this is where he started, as I say, his undergraduate, and he would have come cycling down these roads here, cycling in to the college. He was a very keen cyclist. Indeed, he embarked on a 1,000-mile journey whilst an undergrad to the south of France to look at castles in France. But it was here, where in Jesus College, where he developed that love. I am now in Dorset, and the brooding castle behind me is Corfe Castle, one of T.E. Lawrence's favourite sites to come on his motorbike. And this is actually a good place to explain to you why T.E. Lawrence is so famous and why he is of significance. Because he's had quite an ordinary life really before 1908, 1909, 1910, ultimately the First World War. But he leaves Oxford, he gets a first in a dissertation on Crusader castles, so he explores the Middle East. He then gets a job in the Middle East as an archaeologist on a Hittite site called Carchemish, and then eventually he signs up to join the Arab Bureau, intelligence spying essentially in Cairo for the British as a sort of employee of the British Empire. And then the First World War breaks out, and the First World War is obviously, we know all about Britain versus Germany in the Western Front battling in the Somme, but another key component of the First World War, of course, was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, they controlled the area of Turkey, Syria, modern day, even all the way down to Mecca, etc. They joined the side of the Germans, and so they were fighting against the British. Lawrence finds himself in Cairo at this time, signs up to fight against the Ottomans. Now, it's fair to say the Ottomans were in a vulnerable position, actually. The Ottoman Empire had been around for 500 years, this huge bit of area of land, but it was fragmenting. And one thing that Lawrence knew, because he was an Arabist, he could speak Arabic, and he was great friends with many Arabs, he knew that the Arabs could make a revolt against the Ottoman Empire. All that needed to happen was that they needed to unite the Arabs. The British, led by Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, not Prime Minister at this time, they disagreed, and they thought actually the best way to beat the Ottomans was through a land invasion, so they decided to invade Gallipoli, and that was a total failure. Feeling vindicated then, Lawrence decides that he needs to unite the Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire. But he has to really fight against the British, who were not so sure about this. And so Lawrence eventually sort of inveigled himself into the Arab tribes, and he joined up with a man called Faisal, the Hashemite leader, to try and unite the various different tribes to take on the Ottomans. And they do. They do it through guerrilla warfare, blowing up railways, attacking with horses into the desert. See, not conventional warfare that everybody was expecting. Lawrence was leading this from right from the front. He's an amazing example of the first use of guerrilla warfare tactics of the 20th century, something that's going to become very, very important. Another great fabled part of Lawrence's time in the desert is the march on Aqaba. With just 50 Arabs, they walked for 40 days across the desert to take the port of Aqaba so that they could take the control, they can get the ships in, supplies, to ultimately defeat the Ottomans. The Ottomans do fail, and of course we know the British and the Arabs are on the side of the winning party because the Germans are defeated as well. All that's great. He wasn't that famous still after that. It wasn't really until 1919 when an American journalist had made a great film and various different articles about this man, this hero of the desert. And it was lapped up by the people massively. I think because the horrors of World War One had come about, the brutality of the trenches, bogged down in the Western Front, to suddenly hear this tale of a man who dressed up in Arab robes, guerrilla warfare in the desert, marching across the lands for 40 days, etc. Huge tales of boys' own stuff that the British really, really loved. And so overnight, Lawrence became a massive celebrity. This is another great example of our first wartime celebrity or of that kind of ilk. He did not like that, though, and we're going to look at that as we go forward in our time in Dorset. We'll see how he really disliked that. Just one thing to mention here, I'll keep mentioning it again, is that he was very depressed by this because by the end of the war, because the British had promised the Arabs a free state, but they'd also promised the Jews a land of the Jews in the Balfour Declaration, and they had promised the French that they would divide things up in the Sykes-Picot. So the British had promised three people the same thing, and Lawrence felt it should be the Arabs who got that thing. We'll look at that further. Behind me is the Ashmolean Museum, which Lawrence would visit as a child and was fascinated by the things he saw there from the Middle East, etc. And actually nowadays inside there, which we're going to go to, is something very tangible connected to him. Just behind me here, you can see the robes that Lawrence wore through the desert. You can even see his shoes behind me there as well. This is he would have looked like as he led the Arab revolt. This is a statue to the Imperial Royal Camel Corps, who served in the desert of the Middle East during World War One. This wasn't specifically Lawrence's regiment. He went on secondment to King Faisal and to the Arab Revolt, but he would have definitely been a word to people like this. But it's more that I like the fact it's a World War One soldier on a camel. Indeed, we have an officer here looking into the sun with his camel. And just around here as well, you've got some of the list of names of men who died as well. But of course, some of the battles, including the Hejaz Railway, the famous railway that, of course, Lawrence was doing guerrilla warfare and blowing up. This is a busy embankment garden, but come along here to have a look at the man on the camel. Behind me is 14 Barton Street in Westminster, London, a city that Lawrence described as the perfect place to live. Now, he lived here in 1919 at the height of his fame, but it was not made public to the general population, so he could hide away from the adoring crowds. In fact, he actually just lived in the tiny attic room at the top, and people who went to visit him, including George Bernard Shaw, described it as full of books that he could barely get to his bed because it was completely surrounded by his books. But he loved the seclusion that this offered here and away from the adoring fans, and actually he wrote a lot of his book, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, in there, but perhaps this still was not secluded enough. Behind me is the door to 4 Henrietta Street, and on 10:30 a.m. on the 30th of August 1922, T.E. Lawrence walked into this door, having paced up the street for, in his diary, he said a couple of hours, really worried, and he went into the little door here. Why? Well, he was fed up with all the fame, with all the adulation, with all the notoriety. He'd been dealing with big issues. He'd just been at the Paris Peace Conference, dealing with the Treaty of Versailles for the Arabs. He had had enough, so he changed his name to Ross, and he came here to join the RAF as a private even. Just a complete nobody, wanted anonymity. The problem is, the press followed him around, and actually a year later, he left the RAF and decided to join the tank regiment, where he went down to Dorset. But this is a really profound moment, a real turning point in his life, where he ran away from the fame and the adulation to try and make himself an unknown recluse. This is Bovington in Dorset, which Lawrence came to when he was running away from the fame that he suffered in London. He came here to join the tank corps, the tank regiment, which is why he was based here in Dorset. I think they're practicing today. Well, I've walked through the woods from Bovington Camp and I've arrived at Clouds Hill, which was his cottage that he bought. He was walking in the woods here and he found this derelict cottage and he waterproofed it up and he eventually just built it up to barely livable standards. But he was running away from this fame, I was saying here. I think he definitely had post-traumatic stress syndrome after the war. He also found out that he was illegitimate, his parents weren't married. And as he, in 1919, 1920, he found this out. So he came to hide away, I think, from this all. And he arrived at this little cottage here. We can go inside. It's so small and so dark, though, that I'll just have to try and explain it to you through the written words instead. Well, conditions, as you can see, in a day like today, are pretty bad on this road. And indeed, on the 13th of May, 1935, it was a lot more undulating, this road, than it is now. T. Lawrence was driving from Bovington Camp at the back there, where he was based, to his home, Clouds Hill, just up there. Two boys were playing with their bicycles just on the road there. He saw them, he swerved, and he went down here. Let's go have a look. Well, the road is just up there, and here is the site of the motorcycle crash of T. Lawrence. 13th of May 1935, I said. He was in a coma, taken to hospital at the camp at Bovington, and died several days later of his injuries. He was only 48 years old, and by this time it was a shock, of course, but he had spent so long running away from his fame, but that didn't stop him having a huge funeral for him and memorials, etc., that we still see today. This is St Martin's Church in the Dorset town of Wareham, and unfortunately today it's locked. I can't go in there, but which is a shame, because actually inside here is the effigy of T.E. Lawrence. It's not actually his grave, but his friend Eric Kennington sculpted this for him, and it was been put in here. Let's see if I can turn around and see if we can get a picture of it. Here he is. There is Lawrence. As I say, it's not actually his grave, but it's the effigy of his tomb, and he's lying there like a Crusader knight, which is obviously very ironic considering he studied that and was a huge medieval Arthurian and inspired, and he's got a similar tomb to them. I think elsewhere in the church there are other graves similar to this of Knights the Templar, of real Crusader knights, which is extraordinary. You'll notice as well he is in his keffiyeh and the traditional dress of that he adopted as he befriended many Arabs. And you'll also notice he is carrying his dagger, his kunjar that he was given to him by his friend Nasser and Faisal. But there he is in this church in Dorset. Sadly, I can't go in today, but isn't that an extraordinary place to see this effigy of Lawrence? But that's not actually where he's buried, so let's go and see where he's buried. I'm in the small Dorset village of Moreton, just try and find, and I'm in the graveyard here, trying to find the grave of T. Lawrence, his final resting place. And so here he is, the man we've been following through Oxford, through London, and sadly not through the Middle East, and now here in Dorset. This is the final resting place of T.E. Lawrence. This is a good place maybe to end and to talk about his legacy. I mean, okay, he was a celebrity, a modern idea, the celebrity followed by the news cameras, etc. And that's what brought this fame, a fame that he did not want and he did not like, and that he really tried to hide away from. But the sort of renown that came with his writings and the great stories that were written about him just followed him for the rest of his life. What about his legacy in the Middle East? Many would applaud him for what he did, ending the Ottoman Empire, giving a voice to the Arabs, to the idea of an Arab state and pushing them forward. But he perhaps also is wrapped up in the idea that the Arabs were lied to by the British. They were promising the same thing to three people: the French, the Jewish state, and of course the Arabs, and ultimately the Arabs lost out on that, and Israel and Palestine definitely is still a major issue. We perhaps can't put that right at his door, but he was part of this idea, this issue. Also, there was no state for the Kurds. There's huge issues in these straight lines in the desert that the British drew after the war as well. Again, not his fault directly, but he was the symbol for this. But he's just one of those great romantic, eccentric British heroes, and I think that's somebody who we should celebrate ultimately. But I hope you've enjoyed this one. Do go and find out more about T. Lawrence, and please make sure you subscribe. Thank you so much for joining us.